It was Christmas Eve, and the entire city was bathed in a golden glow. The streets below bustled with activity. Laughter filled the air, and families huddled together, rushing home with last-minute gifts in hand. The aroma of fresh pine trees and roasted chestnuts drifted through the crisp winter breeze. Children with wide eyes gazed at the holiday lights, their faces full of wonder, while carolers sang on every corner, filling the night with warmth and joy. Yet, high above it all, in a grand, luxurious mansion perched on a hill, Henry Lawson sat alone. The mansion, with its marble floors, towering ceilings, and priceless art, was a testament to the empire he had built from the ground up. Henry was a self-made billionaire, a tech titan whose innovations had changed the world. His name was synonymous with success. But tonight, despite his wealth and power, his life felt emptier than ever. Henry had everything one could dream of: private jets, luxury yachts, sprawling estates in 5 different countries, all at his fingertips. Yet, none of these things brought him comfort anymore. What he didn't have was family. No wife to greet him with a smile, no children to fill the house with laughter. His work had consumed him for decades, and now at 52, he found himself utterly alone. The festive season, once a time of joy, had become a harsh reminder of the sacrifices he had made. Sacrifices that left him isolated, even in his greatest success. He sat in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the snow falling gently onto the expansive lawn. The thick snow blanketed the trees and rooftops below, creating a serene, almost magical landscape. But Henry felt no magic tonight. His heart was heavy, a strange hollowness growing in his chest. The massive house, once a symbol of all his achievements, now felt like a cold, empty shell. Every room echoed with silence, the kind that gnawed at him and disturbed him. And suddenly he realized he was alone. For years, Henry had ignored the holidays, brushing them off as a distraction from his ambitions. Christmas dinners were spent in boardrooms, and New Year's Eve was just another night to plan the next big deal. But this year was different. This year, the silence was unbearable. He could feel the weight of his solitude more than ever. The ticking of the antique clock in the hallway seemed louder, each second reminding him of the life he had missed out on. The moments he had traded for more success, more money, more of everything. Except what truly mattered. As he took a sip from the crystal glass of whiskey in his hand, Henry's mind drifted to the past. He remembered his younger self, full of ambition and drive, willing to do whatever it took to reach the top. He had told himself that there would be time for family later, that success would bring him happiness. But as the years passed, his relationships faded. Friends drifted away, and he became more distant from those who had once been close. Now, on this quiet Christmas Eve, Henry sat in the glow of his wealth, but none of it brought him peace. The festive lights twinkling outside were a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. He had never allowed himself to slow down, to truly live in the present. He had always been chasing the next big thing, but now, with no one to share it with, it all seemed meaningless. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the empty mansion, breaking the heavy silence. Henry blinked, startled. It was strange. No one ever came to visit him, especially not on Christmas Eve. The staff had all gone home for the holidays, and there was no reason for anyone to be at his door. Curious, Henry rose from his chair, his footsteps echoing through the long hallway as he approached the front door. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it slowly. Standing in the soft glow of the porch lights was a figure, wrapped in a thick winter coat and scarf, holding a small package in their hands. The snow swirled around them, the cold wind biting at their cheeks, but there was something in their eyes, a warmth, a spark of life that Henry hadn't seen in a long time. "Mr. Lawson," the stranger said, their voice gentle but firm. "I know you weren't expecting anyone, but I have something for you. Something you may not even realize you need." Henry stared at the package, then back at the stranger's face. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity, perhaps even hope. What could this stranger possibly have that would make any difference to him? Was he trying to murder his way out of curiosity? He felt like hell. With a slight nod, Henry stepped aside and let the stranger into his home. Little did he know, the gift they carried would change his life forever. Just as Henry poured himself another glass of whiskey, the sound of a knock reverberated through the vast, empty mansion, shattering the stillness that had engulfed the evening. His hand froze mid-pour, and the amber liquid splashed lightly against the glass before he set it down, his heart pounding at the sudden silence. Who could possibly be knocking at his door on Christmas Eve? He wasn't expecting anyone. He never did, not on Christmas or any other day. For years, his home had been void of visitors, especially during the holidays. Curiosity, mixed with a hint of unease, tugged at him. He rose from the comfort of his leather chair and made his way across the grand marble foyer. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the high ceilings, each step amplifying the tension that gripped him. He hesitated as he reached the heavy oak door, glancing toward the security camera feed on the wall. The grainy image showed a lone figure standing outside, shivering slightly in the cold. Taking a deep breath, Henry unlocked the door and pulled it open cautiously, the frigid winter air sweeping in and biting at his skin. Standing before him was a stranger, a middle-aged man, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a simple, well-worn coat. His face was ruddy from the coat, and snowflakes clung to the dark wool of his collar. In his gloved hands, he held a small, wrapped gift, no bigger than a shoebox. The man looked up at Henry with a warm, almost disarming smile, one that immediately unsettled him. There was something unusual about it, a kindness, a familiarity that made Henry feel exposed, vulnerable, as if the man could see past his wealth and success and into the loneliness that had consumed him for years. "Good evening, sir," the man greeted, his voice soft yet steady. "My name is David. I've brought you something." He extended the small package toward Henry with both hands, his gaze never wavering, his smile unwavering. Henry frowned, taken aback by the sudden and unexpected gesture. He didn't recognize this man, had never seen him before in his life. His immediate instinct was suspicion. His wealth made him a target for all sorts of schemes and unsolicited acts of charity that often came with hidden motives. And yet, this man seemed different. There was no sense of urgency, no demand in his tone, just quiet confidence. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" Henry asked, his voice laced with confusion and a hint of wariness. He crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes slightly as he studied the stranger. David shook his head slowly, his smile fading into something more sincere, more serious. "No, Mr. Lawson, we've never met, but that doesn't matter tonight. I've come here because I believe you need this more than anyone else. I can't explain how I know, but sometimes we're led to places for reasons we can't fully understand until it's time." Henry's brow furrowed further as he glanced down at the package. His curiosity was piqued, but so was his skepticism. Who was this man to presume what he needed, to show up at his doorstep unannounced with a gift in hand, as if he understood the emptiness Henry had been feeling? For a moment, Henry considered closing the door and dismissing the stranger, retreating to his isolated world where no one could reach him. But something in David's voice, in the sincerity of his eyes, kept him standing there, hesitating. "I don't understand," Henry finally said, his tone softer now, almost cautious. "What is this? Why me?" David chuckled lightly, the sound gentle and unforced, as though he knew something Henry didn't. "The truth is, I don't fully know why you," he admitted. "But I do know that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones we don't expect. You may not realize it yet, But this gift holds more than what's inside the box. It's something you've been searching for, even if you didn't know it." Henry's gaze flickered to the small package once more. It was wrapped simply, in brown paper with a single red ribbon tied around it, and yet it seemed to radiate an odd sense of importance. His fingers twitched at his sides, an unfamiliar sense of longing rising within him. The stranger's words struck something deep, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or the desire for connection, for meaning beyond the material wealth that surrounded him. Against his better judgment, Henry reached out and took the gift, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was light, almost too light for something so profound, and yet he felt the significance in that moment. His heart raced as he glanced back up at David, who was now watching him with a look of quiet satisfaction. "Open it when you're ready," David said softly. "And when you do, remember, sometimes the greatest treasures in life aren't what we expect them to be." Before Henry could respond, David turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. Henry stood frozen at the doorstep, staring at the gift in his hands, feeling an inexplicable shift within him. For the first time in years, he felt something more than the cold emptiness that had defined his life for so long. He felt the possibility of change, of redemption, of finding something he hadn't even realized he was missing. With a final glance into the snowy night, Henry closed the door and carried the gift inside, the weight of the stranger's words lingering in the air. Reluctantly, Henry accepted the gift, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he took the small, unassuming package. It was light, almost too light, for something that seemed to carry such weight in the way David had spoken about it. The wrapping was simple, just plain brown paper tied with a modest red bow. There was no extravagance, no sign of the wealth that Henry was so accustomed to, yet somehow it felt more significant than anything else in the grand mansion. He stepped aside, motioning for David to come in from the biting cold. The stranger nodded in thanks, stepping into the warmth of the foyer as Henry closed the door behind him. David shook off the snow from his coat and glanced around briefly at the opulence surrounding him. But there was no awe in his eyes, only a quiet respect for the man standing before him. They made their way to the living room, where the large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the room. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the space, filling the silence that hung heavy between them. Henry gestured toward the leather armchairs near the hearth, and they both sat down. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire moment was teetering on the edge of something monumental. Henry's gaze drifted to the package in his lap, his fingers brushing over the simple bow as he hesitated. There was something about the gift that unsettled him, an inexplicable weight he couldn't quite understand. He glanced at David, whose calm and patient demeanor did little to quell the storm of emotions building inside him. With a deep breath, Henry began to unwrap the package, peeling away the paper slowly, almost reverently. Inside was a small, old, hand-carved wooden box. The wood was worn with age, the carvings intricate, but faded, as though it had been handled many times over the years. Henry's heart began to race, his breath catching slightly as he opened the lid with trembling hands. What he saw inside made his heart stop. There, lying gently within the box, was a photograph. One he hadn't seen in decades, not since he was a young boy. It was a picture of him as a child, no more than 7 years old, sitting between his parents on a Christmas morning. His mother's arm was wrapped around him, her face beaming with joy, while his father sat beside them, smiling in a way Henry had almost forgotten. They looked so happy, so complete, before life had pulled them apart, before ambition and distance had torn their family to shreds. Henry's eyes welled with tears, his throat tightening as he gazed at the image. His breath hitched, and for a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't move. Memories flooded back, of Christmas mornings filled with laughter, of his mother's warm hugs, of his father's proud smile. Memories of a time before everything had gone wrong, before the cold distance between them had grown too wide to bridge. How did you get this?" Henry finally managed to ask, his voice cracking as he looked up at David, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and raw emotion. "I thought this was lost. I haven't seen this picture in years." David leaned forward slightly, his expression soft, his eyes full of understanding and a quiet sadness. "Your father gave it to me," he said gently, his voice steady. "Many years ago." Henry blinked, stunned. His father had passed away decades ago, and they hadn't spoken for years before that. The pain of their estrangement still lingered in his heart, a wound that had never fully healed. "My father," he echoed, his mind racing. "Why? Why would he give this to you?" David paused, his gaze never leaving Henry's. He seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if understanding the gravity of what he was about to say. "Your father regretted not making amends with you before he passed," David said softly. "He carried that regret with him for the rest of his life. He didn't know how to reach you, how to bridge the gap that had grown between you. But before he passed, he gave me this photograph and asked me to find you. He wanted me to give it to you when the time was right. Gran says he hopes you will never forget." Henry's chest tightened as he processed David's words. His father, whom he hadn't seen or spoken to in the years leading up to his death, had wanted to make amends. He had wanted to repair the broken relationship that had haunted both of them. The revelation hit him like a wave, overwhelming and bittersweet. "Well now," Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "why, after all this time?" David looked at him with a gentle smile, his eyes reflecting both compassion and wisdom. "Because tonight, on Christmas, I knew it was time. This holiday, this night. It's a time for family, for forgiveness, for healing old wounds. Your father knew you'd need this more than you could ever realize. He hoped, in some way, it would bring you peace." Henry stared at the photograph, his vision blurred by tears. He could hardly believe it. The memories of his father, both good and bad, rushed to the surface, mingling with the deep regret that had weighed on him for years. He had spent so much of his life running, building his empire, convincing himself that success would fill the void. But now, sitting in the silence of his grand home, holding a piece of his past, he realized how wrong he had been. For the first time in years, Henry allowed himself to feel the emotions he had buried for so long. The grief, the guilt, the longing for the connection he had lost. And as he looked at the photo, at the innocent boy he had once been, surrounded by love, he understood something he had never let himself admit before. None of his wealth, none of his achievements, could ever replace the family he had lost. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find some semblance of that connection again. David watched in silence as Henry wiped the tears from his eyes. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice low and filled with hope. "Your father wanted you to know that it's never too late, Henry. It's never too late to make things right." Henry looked up at David, his heart heavy but hopeful. And for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of healing, of finding peace, not in the riches he had accumulated, but in the relationships he had neglected. The path ahead was uncertain, but this small gift, this photograph, had opened a door he hadn't even realized was closed. "Thank you," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "Thank you for bringing this to me." David nodded, his smile warm and knowing. "Merry Christmas, Henry." Henry sat in stunned silence, the photograph trembling in his hands as memories flooded back. His father's face, once a symbol of strength and authority, now seemed distant, like a figure from another lifetime. The image of them together on Christmas morning, his parents beaming with pride as young Henry sat on the floor, surrounded by gifts, brought a sharp pang to his chest. It was before everything had changed, before the endless battles for success, the arguments that pushed them further apart, and before his father's sudden death. This was when Kakai had been 2. His father had always been strict, driven by his own idea of success. Henry had admired him as a child, but as he grew older, resentment began to build. When Henry decided to venture into tech instead of joining the family business, it had broken something between them. He had wanted to prove he was his own person, capable of succeeding on his own terms. But it wasn't just about business. It was about wanting his father's approval, wanting to escape his shadow, and finding his own path. They had fought bitterly. Henry had walked away, determined to build a future without the weight of his father's expectations, and for years he did just that. But no matter how high his company soared, no matter how much wealth he amassed, something always felt hollow. In the quiet moments, he'd feel the emptiness, the loneliness. The success he had worked so hard for had not filled the void of love and connection that he had once taken for granted. When his father passed away unexpectedly, Henry's world had shifted. The guilt was overwhelming. He never got the chance to make amends, never got to tell his father how much he had needed him, how much he had longed for his approval. The final words between them had been harsh, filled with regret and anger. Now here he was, with all his accomplishments, yet he felt like he had failed in the one thing that truly mattered: family. "I don't understand," Henry whispered, his voice barely above a breath. He wiped away the tear that had fallen down his cheek, his hand still trembling around the photograph. "Why now?" David's expression softened, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and steady, but full of understanding. "Your father knew this day would come," he said gently. "He knew there would be a moment in your life when you'd realize that success and wealth wouldn't be enough, when you'd realize that what truly matters is the love and the connections we make, not the things we accumulate." Henry's heart ached as David's words sank in. The weight of it all felt unbearable. All this time he had been chasing after more money, more power, more validation, but none of it had ever filled the emptiness inside. He had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, the people he loved. His father, in his own way, had tried to teach him that. And now, through this unexpected gift, David had delivered that lesson to him. "This," David continued, gesturing toward the photograph, "is his way of reminding you that it's never too late to seek forgiveness, to make amends. He regretted not having the chance to reconcile before he passed, but he wanted you to know that he never stopped loving you." Henry's eyes blurred with tears as the full weight of his father's unspoken love hit him. It wasn't just about the material things he had gained. It was about the relationships he had neglected in his pursuit of success. And now, at 52, he was finally understanding that. David sat back, his gaze unwavering. "You don't need to say anything," he said softly. "Just know that it's never too late to find peace with yourself, to forgive, and to heal the wounds that have been buried for so long." For the first time in years, Henry felt a flicker of hope. The guilt that had weighed so heavily on him seemed a little lighter. The mansion around him, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt less cold, as if the warmth of reconciliation was beginning to settle into his soul. His father's love, though never fully realized, was still there, reaching out to him, urging him to let go of the past and embrace the possibility of healing. Henry nodded slowly, wiping his eyes as he looked at David. The man's kindness was overwhelming, and Henry realized that in this strange and unexpected encounter, he had been given something far more valuable than any material possession. He had been given a chance for redemption, for healing, for a new beginning. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth filling the room. Outside, the the snow continued to fall gently, like a soft blanket over the world. And for the first time in years, Henry felt peace, knowing that it wasn't too late to make things right. The weight of the moment hung in the air, a palpable shift that Henry couldn't quite explain. The photograph, now cradled in his hands, felt heavier than any material possession he had ever held. It wasn't just a picture. It was a doorway, a second chance. The long-forgotten memories of family, love, and warmth flooded his mind, pushing aside the years of isolation and ambition that had defined his life. In that moment, Henry realized something profound. His father, despite their differences, had always wanted the best for him. The love that had once existed between them, buried beneath layers of pride, had never truly disappeared. The distance they had suffered in the final years of his father's life didn't negate the love that had been there in his childhood, the bond they had shared before it had all become about business, success, and personal ambition. The photograph, the simple gift from a stranger, was a symbol of reconciliation, a reminder that the greatest legacy a man can leave behind isn't wealth, but love and the connections he fosters. Henry felt something stir deep within him, a realization that had eluded him for so many years. His pursuit of wealth, while fulfilling in one sense, had come at an immense cost. The loneliness, the absence of meaningful relationships, had eaten away at him slowly, until he had become so consumed by success that he forgot what really mattered. But as he sat there, holding the photograph, the truth became undeniable. He could never undo the mistakes of the past, never bring back the days he had lost with his father. But he could change the future. He could choose differently. Christmas, he now understood, wasn't about presents or wealth. It was about love, family, and the connections that truly define us. The quiet crackling of the fire filled the room as Henry took a deep breath, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He realized the gift David had given him wasn't just a photograph. It was a chance to reconnect with what he had lost. It was a chance to live a life of meaning, to honor the memory of his father in ways he had never considered. With newfound clarity, Henry turned to David, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his words trembling as he looked at the man who had somehow given him back a piece of himself. "I needed this, more than you could ever know." David's smile was warm, understanding, and filled with an unspoken wisdom that seemed to transcend the moment. He stood, preparing to leave, but not without offering one last piece of insight. "Sometimes, the best gifts aren't the ones that can be wrapped or bought," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "Sometimes, the best gifts are the ones that remind us of who we truly are." Henry watched as David turned toward the door, the sound of his footsteps soft in the grand, empty house. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel as cold, as distant. He felt a shift in himself, a new sense of purpose, as if the journey he had been on, alone, for so long, had finally reached a turning point. David paused at the door, glancing back with a final smile. "Merry Christmas, Henry," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "And Merry Christmas," Henry replied, his voice steady and full of gratitude, the weight of the past slowly lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, knowing that his story wasn't over, that he still had time to change, to reconnect, and to build the kind of life his father had always wanted for him. The future, no longer defined by solitude and success, was now about finding the love and connections he had once taken for granted. As the door closed behind David, Henry sat back in the chair, the photograph still in his hands, and let the warmth of the fire fill the room. Christmas, he realized, had never been about the gifts, the extravagance, or the empty pursuits of success. It was about moments like this, when a simple act of kindness could change a life forever. As David stepped out into the snowy night, Henry stood at the door, watching him disappear into the distance, his heart inexplicably lighter. The cold air outside seemed to mirror the chill Henry had felt in his life for so long. But now it was different. The weight of solitude no longer felt so suffocating. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, as if a long-forgotten warmth had begun to return to his soul. The silence of the night, once so oppressive, now felt like a calm that enveloped him, a space where healing could begin. Standing there, Henry realized that the Christmas he had feared, one spent alone in his mansion, had instead turned into a turning point. He had been given more than just a photograph or a message from his late father. He had been given a second chance at life, at relationships, at love. And it was a chance he wasn't about to let slip away. That night, instead of sinking into the familiar emptiness of solitude, Henry took action. He reached for the phone, dialed numbers he hadn't dialed in years, numbers of old friends, colleagues, and even distant family members. As he heard their voices on the other end of the line, something inside him thawed. The walls he had built around himself slowly began to crumble. Henry apologized for the years of distance, for the hurt he had caused by prioritizing his work over the people who had once been his closest companions. Some were surprised, others were hesitant, but all of them responded with warmth and understanding, the way old friends do when time and distance don't matter. When he hung up the last call, Henry realized something profound. He wasn't alone anymore. He had spent so many years thinking that wealth and success were the keys to everything, but in that moment, he understood that the real treasures in life were the people who cared about him, the bonds that had been neglected but were still waiting to be rekindled. The next morning, Henry's house, once cold and empty, was filled with laughter, warmth, and the sound of life again. The dining room, which had often sat untouched during Christmas meals, now echoed with the joyful chatter of friends and loved ones who had gathered at his invitation. They came with open hearts, bringing not just their presents, but also their forgiveness and their love. Henry, for the first time in a long while, was surrounded by people who saw him for who he truly was, not just as the billionaire tech mogul, but as a man who had made mistakes, but was ready to make things right. The Christmas tree in the corner, once a symbol of empty tradition, now sparkled with meaning. The warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, mingling with the joy in the room. Henry found himself laughing, a real, unforced laugh, and it felt good. It felt like a part of him had come alive again, a part that had been buried under years of ambition, pride, and loneliness. He looked around the room and realized that this feeling of connection and love was what he had been missing all along. The stranger's unexpected gift had changed everything. It wasn't the material possession or the message from the past that mattered most. It was the reminder that even in the loneliest moments, love has a way of finding us when we least expect it. The photograph, the gesture, and the quiet wisdom of a stranger had opened his eyes to what he had long ignored. That love and connection were more important than all the wealth in the world. Henry had learned that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive isn't something we can hold in our hands, but something that touches our hearts. The gift of forgiveness, of second chances, of healing. Those were the true treasures, the ones that would stay with him long after the presents were opened and the decorations came down. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all. True wealth isn't measured by money or success, but by the relationships and memories we build along the way. Even the smallest acts of kindness can rekindle the connections that matter most, especially during the holidays. Done.